So good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, and thank you for taking time out. I know this is a very interesting time of the year when things are slow and everybody is happy going on holiday and stuff like that. Uh, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic, which is a slightly different topic than I normally discuss. But I thought, I've first of all, I must thank Digital Vidya and Pradeep and the team. I know we started this about 5 years ago. When 5 or 6 years ago, I used to be the a CMO of a small boutique firm, and one of my team members, Harika, she was very keen that I do a webinar externally, and she had got me in touch with Pradeep, and we had done this first webinar about 5 or 6 years ago. And since then, I think every year I've done one webinar, and as I've done these webinars, I've taken on topics like influencer marketing, social media, digital marketing, stuff like that. But this time I wanted to go slightly deeper. I wanted to talk about influence and how does that affect your revenue stream. And this comes out of my experience both as a salesperson, how I started my career as a doctor and a medical practitioner, and the interactions I used to have with my patients, and also the work I've done in digital. So I thought of combining all of that and bringing my perspective on influence to you. Second of all, I know we love multitasking, and I'm sure you've got like many other things going on as this webinar is going on. I'll request you to pay attention here because this is slightly interactive and engaging. And what I'll try to do is, pause in between, ask you a few questions that you can reply by chat. The other thing is, if you have any questions, please do let me know. And Divya, if there are any questions that are coming through chat, please alert me in case I've lost track of that. So I'm trying to open my chat window here. Yes. And if there's anything specific to me, let me know. All right. So, when we talk about influence, the first thing I want to talk about is relationship. So I just talked about having worked with Pradeep and Divya and the entire wonderful team at Digital Vidya for the last 5 years. And over the last 5 years, we've developed a relationship. What you will find very interesting, whether you're in sales, marketing, business development, or you are running a business, or you're leading a practice, the most important thing, the most cornerstone of all this is relationship. Almost all business in India gets done on relationship, which is very fascinating. I know people say that things have changed and we've become very transactional, but that is not the case. We still love relationships, we build relationships, and one of the things that I've noticed is over a period of time, you would see that a lot of your interactions are with people you already know. That you know these people either through work or through personal connections, through family, through common interests, and in other words, you have a relationship with them. The biggest source of influence for you as an individual are the relationships you carry. That is the cornerstone of any influence building strategy that you might have. And I'm going to distinguish this from influencer marketing as we understand it, and see, compare and contrast both, right? So for now, just focus on relationships. And a good example is how we are in this webinar today is because I have a relationship with, say, Pradeep and Divya and Digital Vidya. So at this note, I want you to also keep some pen and paper ready, take down some notes, shut down all other windows, and very quickly answer this question for me. These are questions that I ask myself. These are questions that I ask all my teams that want to discuss relationship or influence with me. Is write down the three key relationships that you have, right, in business. It could be your largest clients. It could be your most dependable partner or vendor. It could be your a source of competitive advantage for you. It would be somebody who's working alongside you. Write down the 3 key relationships that you have, right? Write it down on a piece of paper right now. uh, and it could be somebody in the family as well. I'm not saying family is not relationship, but it has to be a business relationship, somebody who's helping you with your business. If you don't run a business, then it's somebody who's helping you with your work, right? And under that, right, how did you develop that relationship? How did you develop them, right? When I say develop, it means it could be somebody in your family, it could be a distant relative, but how did they become involved with you as a person, right? And how has that helped you? In the sense that, has it helped you get more revenue, get better margin, hold on to critical clients? You know, sorry, I have this alert that keeps coming up. How has that helped you? Has it helped you grow? Has it helped you mature? Has it helped you learn? Uh, and the third and the most important key question, and these are things that you should write down now, but ponder about it even after the webinar, right? Are these personal connects that became business connects, or the other way around? Well, let me give you an example. Is it a friend that you know since childhood and both of you, decided to do business together, or he became a colleague, or he became your boss, or you became his boss? Uh, or was it somebody you just met at work or met due to some business transaction and has become a friend now? And these are very important things to analyze, because this relationships is your biggest source of influence. Understanding how you're building these relationships, how they have helped you, and what is the source of these relationships will give you a good insight as to how you're building influence. Is everybody with me so far? Say yes if you are, and if you're not, then say no. I'm going to pause for a minute. Has everybody done the exercise? All right. Okay. Yes, 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 yes. Very good. So almost everybody has done this exercise. Very good. Happy to hear that. All right. So let me move on. This is a very important exercise, and if you still have questions on that, we'll be happy to take them at the end of the webinar. But I want you to make this the cornerstone of your exercise. Now let's start with, once we've set aside that relationships are your biggest source of influence, let's start talking about how to create, develop, manage influence, right? And for this, I have a story. I have a story that takes us back a few years. And some time ago in the US, there was a very young graduate student at Stanford. Stanford is in California. It's on the western side of the US, and Stanford has produced great companies like Google, which have come out of Stanford. Stanford continues to be the innovation hub. And there was this young graduate student at Stanford, and he was, obviously he had an idea that he could raise some money. I think he was part of one of the clubs, and he was trying to raise money to get a very famous Polish pianist to play at Stanford. And in America, and it's pretty much the culture in India these days as well, especially if you go to B schools and large universities, where students are encouraged to do these business activities as a source of learning, that they learn and they gather information. And this student, as part of his maybe a culture club or something like that, he was trying to organize this piano concert. What happened was, unfortunately, the pianist was an extremely world-renowned pianist, and his manager said that you have to, guarantee $20,000 or some amount like that. This was still way back when $20,000 was quite a large amount. And he said, you have to guarantee $20,000 for the pianist to come and play, and that's the only way this concert will happen. So the student agreed. And he went about marketing and maybe producing pamphlets, talking to people, word of mouth, all the below the line, above the line activities that a lot of the marketers are very familiar with. And unfortunately, there was a lot of miscommunication and some confusion. As a result of it, very few people actually showed any interest in turning up for the concert. As the day of the concert drew near, the student went back to the pianist and sought a meeting, and confessed to him that, I tried my best, but I guess we don't have the numbers. We won't even have the money to pay you for the concert. And the pianist looked at the young graduate student and he said, "That's okay. It doesn't matter. I will play nonetheless." And I believe he played to a very few audience who were available, who came to the concert, and he waived off his fees. What is fascinating about the story was the pianist. He genuinely showed. It was an act of kindness, right? Because he had nothing to gain from this, and he had everything to lose. Actually, he lost $20,000, which is a large amount. But things have very, very strange ways of showing back again. And the pianist went on to become the prime minister of his country after World War One, and there was mass starvation in his country. And he turned to he was seeking aid. He was seeking foreign aid for helping his citizens. And by that time, this young graduate student had gone on to become a very influential person in the U.S. administration. And because of the favor, of the act of kindness done to him, he returned the favor by authorizing food aid to Poland. Obviously, the young graduate student is Herbert Hoover, and the pianist was Jan Paderewski. Uh, it's a very fascinating story, and there are many versions of this story, right? Some say it never happened. Some said, Jan was never supposed to play. So there are all these sorts of stories and sidetracks that happen. But what is fascinating about this story is that Jan Paderewski had influence on Herbert Hoover as a graduate student. And this influence he used to Herbert Hoover's advantage by not only waiving off his $20,000, but also performing to a small audience, you know. And that influence created a sense of reciprocity. When Jan Paderewski, became Prime Minister of Poland and asked for aid, Herbert Hoover came to his help. Now, this story is a very unique story, but it's not the only story. There are many stories like that. And you would see in the world of influence that reciprocity is a very important activity. And I want you to keep that in mind. So the first thing we learned today is influence is based on relationships. And relationships are key. How you develop, how you mature, how you build them is very important, especially in this country. What we learned, secondly, is that influence, one of the cornerstones of influence is reciprocity. And we will discuss that more in detail. But I want you to remember this story. I want you to look up this story anytime you have a chance. When you have time to get off social media, just read this fascinating story, the relationship between a pianist and a student. And you would see that this story keeps repeating itself in various forms, right? In India also, we have many examples of how this happens. Before I start there, I want to also talk about what we think of influence, right? We think influence or influencer marketing or influencer management is a set of people who who are very famous on social media. So they have like 10,000 Twitter followers, 20,000 Instagram likes, and they are extremely, they keep putting their photographs, they keep liking pictures. And I know a lot of brands reach out to these influencers. You have YouTube influencers, you have Instagram influencers, and you have these Twitter influencers. And all these people, they come together and they write blogs or put tweets out, and we say this is influence. This is influence. I think that it's a very big myth, right? It's a very big myth that only those on social media have influence. Yes, they have influence to a certain extent. Yes, they can, if you look at the classic IDA model, awareness, interest, desire, action, they probably do influence awareness, and in some cases maybe interest as well. But true influence stems from relationships. And those relationships are not the ones you create on social media, because social media relationships tend to be shallow. Real world relationships seem to be deeper. Secondly, I'm not saying abandon social media, I'm not saying abandon digital marketing. I think digital is a very, very important component of our lives, and anybody who ignores digital is going to do it at his own peril. But let's use digital as a tool to deepen our relationships, to increase influence. And one example you already saw in the story I gave you between Paderewski and Herbert Hoover, who were and how Herbert Hoover was influenced to help Jan in his time of need, right? So this is a cartoon that I really like. Instead of wasting our money on mass media, we are marketing to tens and tens of influencers. Some of them even have a blog. So, so obviously this marketing manager is it's a tongue-in-cheek basically. Some of the influencers also write at times, so excellent. But let's not get limited in our definition of influence, right? Let's not only look at social media. Let's look across the spheres. Let's look at all the relationships we have, and you will see the deepest and the strongest relationships you have are not necessarily on social media. Digital is a good medium to go deepen your relationships, but they have to be based on some kind of a connection you already have. Let's get into some deeper things. So what is influence, just to be clear, and you can use influence both ways. It could be power or authority, which is the noun version of influence. That means, for example, government of India does have influence on our lives because we are governed by the laws laid down in the constitution, which is upheld by the executive, government, and judiciary. So that is influence. I think to an extent, even our culture, religion, family, they all have some power or authority over us, and they are influences in our life. But influence also means lead to believe or do. So as a verb, it creates action. So influence, in my opinion, leads to action in the IDA model. Awareness, interest, desire, action. The action is brought about by influence, right? And there are many examples of it. There are a lot of psychologists globally who have worked on this aspect. You would see that in various industries, and I'll discuss some of them with you. So at this moment, we have established relationships are key. We have established reciprocity is one way of going about it. And we have established that influence, though it can be used as a noun, which means power or authority, and it could be also authority as a subject matter, right? So you could say that the late President APJ Abdul Kalam was an authority on missiles, right? He worked in DRDO all his life, established scientist. He was an authority. It could also mean government. It could mean cultural authority. But it, as a verb, influence leads to action. It lets you take action. So let me look at 3 ways in which influence can be cultivated. Though relationship remains the base, but let's look at 3 other aspects of influence. And the first aspect is contrast principle. Now the contrast principle, and here is an example of how the anti-smoking campaigns, again a big debate. Anti-smoking, does it work, doesn't work? Some people say it works, some people say it doesn't work. But anti-smoking campaigns as such use the contrast principle very well. And they can show you, if you're not smoking, how good, how healthy you'll be, and if you're smoking, how quickly you'll die. There are songs written, ads created, posters, and I believe now that they have all cigarette packets do carry the graphic pictures of how bad cancer can affect you, or pulmonary embolism, COPD, lung obstruction, allergies, breathing disorders. I mean, the list is endless. Here is a very good creative. I personally liked it, which shows a bullet and a cigarette, and it says quick or slow, because one of the common retorts that smokers have is, hey, anyway, all of us are going to die, right? Anyway, whether I smoke or I don't smoke. So anti-smoking campaigns create this. Use the contrast principle, and this is something that you can use in your line of work as well, where they're showing, okay, you want to die quickly, bullet. If you want to die slowly, painfully, struggling through tons of medical bills, hospital visits, doctor appointments, then go on smoking. You'll get there eventually. right? Very good example. And I think that this is one of the things that we should use as I call it the Act One contrast principle. Very good way to increase influence. Let us look at some other examples. So one very good example that I have from retail, and this happened to me when I was younger, when I was in school. So what happens? How the contrast principle works in retail is, suppose you go to a shop and you are shown a very expensive product, right? Uh, and uh, and you are convinced that okay, you need this product. For example, it could be a suit, it could be a shirt, it could be a bag, and retail and fashion does a very good job of it. Uh, and then they sell you accessories based on that. Now, by initially showing you the high-end suit and following it up with accessories which are cheaper uh, in total value, but relatively more expensive, you will not hesitate buying the accessories, right? A good example is a suit and tie. So you buy a suit, and suppose you go to a business suit, and business suit can range anywhere between 5,000 to 50,000 rupees, and they also sell you a tie which is probably 1,500, and relative to the suit the tie feels cheaper, so you end up buying it, right? And that's how most packaging is done. You package the contrasting principle in such a way that the smaller item, which is an accessory, is though relative to its cost is much more expensive, but overall, because you bought an expensive suit, you say, okay, I'm spending 5,000 rupees on the suit, might as well buy a tie for 1,000 rupees. So this happened to me when I went to a shoe store a long time ago as a child, and I bought the shoes and gone with my uncle there. I still remember, and I bought the shoes. And those days in India, you didn't have too many choices. You had only one large shoe store, and you know which one I'm talking about. And then if they had your size, lucky you. If not, then you're in trouble. And I wanted some sport shoes, and they had the sport shoe in my size, luckily that time. But I also wanted I did not want socks, but they said, hey, no, you know what, we have this new line of socks, and you should pick it up. And though the socks was relatively cheaper to the shoe, but in totality it was far more expensive for its category, that is socks. But I ended up buying the shoe and the socks. And later in the evening, when my father came home and looked at it, and he said, you know what, the socks is so expensive. It's really not how a sock should have cost. And I thought to myself, why is he bothered? It's much cheaper than the shoe, right? But that is a good example of how contrast principle is used. I'm not necessarily saying it's a negative principle. I'm saying this is how the contrast principle is used in creating influence. So if you have, say, a high-end product, and you pitch the high-end product, you would see it'll be easier for you if the client accepts your high-end product to package something as an accessory which is way cheaper, but relative to its category more expensive. And a lot of retail sales happens that way. Another good example of how this works is in high-end cars. So what happens is you buy a very expensive car, and this is the end of the year now, so almost every car seller is selling cars at great discounts. You can get an upgrade at a lower rate. You get so many accessories with your car. You get cash off, cash back, all these wonderful things. But if you go to a dealership and you buy a car and you want something extra, like sensors that help you in parking sensors, for example, or rear view camera, you will find that relative to the category, if you go outside and get the same rear view camera, it's way cheaper. But because you're buying a very high-end car, you don't mind spending that much on the rear view camera. So this is a very good example of how do you use the contrast principle. Once I've influenced you enough to buy the high-end product, I can package a relatively cheaper product, but it's more expensive as compared to its category along with it. This is called the contrast principle. Real estate also is using it. These are three industries that I know: automobile, real estate, and retail. Wherever there's B2B2C sales, this principle is used very effectively. I also see it being used in B2B sometimes, when organizations, they say, I want to do a high-end digital transformation project, and I would say that, and the client would say, I don't have the budget for it. So they end up not only doing that project, but taking on something extra, something like something more than what was initially offered, but at a much lower rate, so it doesn't look that expensive. So this is a very good example of how the contrast principle is used. And I know this is a new concept, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this concept. So if there are any questions on this concept, we will take it later on. The second is reciprocation. Now, reciprocation is an activity that leads to a high degree of influence, and we saw in the first example itself how Herbert Hoover and Jan Paderewski, how Jan Paderewski influenced Herbert Hoover to help him later in life, and that happened because of reciprocity. And one of the most interesting stories in this case was, there was a earthquake in Mexico, and the Mexicans called for aid globally, and a lot of countries, helped Mexico. But one of the most interesting help came from Ethiopia. Ethiopia was itself in the middle of a civil war, and they had starvation death themselves. And I think Ethiopia donated either $10,000 or $100,000 to Mexico. And there was a lot of curiosity as to why was a country that was so poor itself helping out another country. And there was some analysis, and they found out that when Italy had invaded Ethiopia in the 1930s, Mexico was one of the few nations that had sent aid to Ethiopia. Remember, this was the days between World War I and World War II, and most of the world was, already there were colonies everywhere, and Mexico was one of the few free countries in the world, and they had given aid to Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians never forgot that, so they reciprocated in Mexico's hour of need, right? And Mexico also, donated the Olmec head to Ethiopia. So these two countries are bound together, so far away, not even geographically in the same area, no strategic interest, but reciprocity helped these two countries have influence in each other. Other examples, I think the best example was in the Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. There's a very interesting story of how the Indian immigrants in Kuwait were not harassed by the Iraqi troops. Actually, they let them go and they let them leave. And there's a movie made on that as well, how the Iraqis did not really harass the Indians. And most of it was because the reciprocity shown by India towards Iraq in their time of need. And as a matter of fact, I believe that the then Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and then President Saddam Hussein were on very good terms, and they were friends. And he reciprocated to his Indian brothers and sisters, telling his forces not to touch the Indians. Another good example of reciprocity you find in most shopkeepers in Delhi. I mean, I'm sure there's shopkeepers everywhere, but most shops in Delhi, they always offer you something free. It could be a soft drink, it could be sweets, it could be a sample, just to make sure that you are not that you feel you feel like reciprocating to the shopkeeper and buying something from their shop. Very, very fascinating concept, a very powerful concept. Once you've done something for somebody, the other person is not going to just sit back and say, okay, thank you very much. We feel obliged to reciprocate in some way or the other, and we will always remember that favor, and we'll do a favor on them, right? So any questions so far? Divya, are we taking questions only in the end, or should we take a few now?
I think we can take up a few questions now.
Yeah, let's do that, because I know these are complex principles. So
Sure.
let's take a few questions now.
Superb. So guys, I can see a few of you have joined in late, so you will get the recording. Don't worry about missing a part of it. And Shweta actually wants to know how does this is one question from Shweta for now. How does this actually similar or different from a consumer buying behavior? How does this process is different from a consumer buying process?
See, the way we understand the consumer buying process is the consumer does a preliminary research, then does a second research, and then just comparison, what we call as value attribute comparison between the different products or services, and which will meet their value the most. and after that they come to, how do they want to buy it, where do they want to buy it, etc. uh, in a way, influence cuts through all that, in a way that you've already decided what to buy and you've decided where to buy, and it's just a question of getting the right price. uh, and that is the difference between a traditional consumer buying behavior model and a model that uses influence. Most extremely successful consumer goods companies, large organizations that have been in B2C business for a long time, understand this very well. And there are so many case studies on how they create this influence. So the objective is not to replace the consumer buying behavior model, but to see how we can cut through some of those steps very quickly and become the only product at top of the mind, right, for a purchase. And I'm not saying that the others don't get it right. It's just a question of finding the right lever for influence. But in India, I mean, this is something which is an evolving field, and we know very little about it because most of our analysis so far has been done through questionnaires and asking people to rate their experience or tell us why you bought this product and what helped you make your buying decision. But what we've understood over the years is people do respond erratically on surveys, and a lot of people lie on surveys. They lie for various reasons. They don't tell the truth. So most of the new research that is coming in on influence, it is not using any traditional survey model, but it's using concepts like using fMRI scans on subjects to understand which part of the brain lights up uh, for various activities. So if I show you a picture of an iPhone and show you a picture of a Samsung phone, Note phone, and which parts of your brain light up with the iPhone and which part of the brain lights up with the Samsung phone, and that determines how much the brand has influenced you one way or the other. So the short answer to your question is no, it is not different, but yes, it gives us more insights of how to crunch through that cycle.
Superb. Thank you so much, Vikram. I think we can move forward here.
Okay. All right. The number three concept of influence is consistency. Now, this is a very important aspect, and especially in India, we do struggle with it because we are not consistent with our behavior. And when we are not consistent with our behavior, our influence keeps dipping. And let me explain with a couple of examples, right? Uh, so the best example I have for being very consistent with your behavior is Singapore. Singapore as a city is smaller than most cities in India. Uh, they have very little area. They have very few people living there. But in terms of influence that small city has in Asia Pacific and even globally, it's mind blowing how much influence Singapore has, right? And one of the reasons why Singapore is so influential in the global sphere of things is because of consistency in its laws. Right from the beginning, Singapore has been very strict about its laws, and there is no way to get around it. When I was in school, there was this American boy who had, used spray can, and a lot of, you see it in all cities in India as well now, where they use spray paint to spray on the walls, and that is a big offense in Singapore. You're not supposed to use spray can. And this boy, who was an American boy, American citizen, had used spray can on a car, and he had sprayed the car, and he was obviously arrested. Interestingly, Singapore has a very fascinating police model, and I will discuss that in some time. But anyway, he was arrested, he was caught, he was charged, and he was to receive some punishment. And I think it was, and Singapore doesn't waste time in putting people in jail. It's a financial punishment or it is lashes. I think it was lashes in his case. And I don't know if lashes are still around, but in the 90s it was a big deal in Singapore. And so this boy had was to receive 11 lashes for his behavior. and because he was a minor, he couldn't be charged financially. Otherwise, Singapore usually charges you financially, the financial fines, and it's pretty much in line with the fines in Scandinavia and places like Sweden and Norway, where your IT returns determine how much fine you get put for the same offense. So two people doing the same offense could have different fines based on their, based on how much IT returns they file. And so the president of the US then had intervened and called Singapore, the premier, to say, you should let that boy go on humanitarian grounds. He's a disturbed child, has a disturbed childhood, etc., etc. But Singapore never budged and eventually reduced 11 lashes to 9, if I'm not mistaken. The laws in Singapore have remained strict. They have strict laws on driving, they have strict laws on garbage, on littering, on jaywalking, on cheating. They have very clear laws, and that is one thing that has remained consistent with that country despite its growth and popularity. Now, the interesting part about Singapore, which I just found out a few months ago, that most of the police force in Singapore, police actions or police activities are outsourced to a security agency, which mostly has ex-policemen in it, and they do most of the police activities in Singapore, and the actual police only does 5%, including arrests and homicide and things like that. So it's a very fascinating model of how consistency builds influence. The other good example is New York subways. Now this is again a very fascinating story. In the 80s, New York crime in New York was going out of control, and the civic authorities were slightly worried. And this was just before the Wall Street crash and all those other things. And civic authorities were very worried. How do you influence citizens to stay within their limits? And they had a big issue with spray can as well. So every night these gangs would come in and spray paint the trains, the subway trains, right, like the metro trains, and then they would, and that became a symbol of what was wrong with the city. So some of the city authorities decided that, what we're going to do, we are not going to let out a train with spray can ever again. If somebody spray paints it, we're going to paint it overnight and not release it till the painting is done. And they started attacking just that aspect of the city. It is very fascinating how, you might think that there are bigger problems to solve. There's murder, there are gun-related incidents, there was drugs, there was so much others happening, but they said, no, we'll go after the trains. And when they started doing it, and you may want to look this up, you may want to write it down, it's called the broken window syndrome. It's a very interesting concept by which, if there is a broken window in one building in an area, soon there'll be other windows that will be broken and the whole area will disintegrate. That's why it's very important in the city to maintain the areas properly. So New York decided to attack the subways, and they cleaned up the subways, and they never let out a train go with graffiti ever again, spray can painting. And what it did eventually is created a sense of what was wrong with the city. And eventually crime started coming down. It started coming down from the train stations, and eventually today New York is a much safer place. If you go to walk in New York, the areas in New York earlier where you couldn't walk because you 100% get mugged, but not anymore. The other example, and I'll take an Indian example this time, just to be familiar, is a hotel chain in Chennai called Sarvana Bhavan. I don't know if you've been to one. I think it has outlets in other cities as well, Delhi and some other places as well. What I like about them is, they probably were one of the first concept, and they have been consistent with their quality and service. It's quick. They don't waste time. Their food is usually fresh, usually good. The prices are reasonable, and it is not for some place to have. It's not a place where you can come and sit down and have a chat. It moves very fast. So they have become consistent. So they have an influence. For example, when I have a business meeting in Chennai to go to, and I have to have breakfast before it, I know if I go to 7, I'll be in and out in 10 minutes, and I can then continue with my meeting. So there's a great deal of influence that brand has on me to come and get in there, because I know I'll get good quality food at fast rate and at a very quick pace, right? So we talked about relationship, we talked about reciprocity, and we talked about contrast principle, and we talked about consistency. I would, if I had to create a pyramid, a matrix, I will put relationship the cornerstone. You need to have a relationship with the brand or whoever you're selling or buying from. And I would put three boxes on top of it. One is contrast principle, one is reciprocity, and the third is consistency. I'm not saying all three levers can be used. It's very difficult for a brand to use more than one lever, maximum two, but all three impossible. As long as there's a relationship with the client, use one of the three levers to increase your influence. Uh, let's look at some of the other important lessons we've learned. And this is specific to India. So if you look at marketing, right? A lot of you are marketers, I believe, on this call. I like the way Amul has been consistent with its messaging, consistent with the imagery. It's always the moped, Amul moped. It's always some current issue, and the moped highlights a current issue. Very consistent. You know what to expect from a Amul commercial. There is no deviation, and they have been at it for so long, and we still look forward to it. Obviously, the quality, price, good quality, good price. It's a cooperative, and you when you buy from Amul, you're supporting the farmers. So I think this is a good example of how to build influence. Right? Be very consistent. Don't, even if it's a bad message. One of my former bosses used to tell me, even if it's a bad message, you should keep talking about it because it sticks eventually. But as long as that message is backed up by consistency, nobody to beat Amul. The other good example of reciprocation uh, in India are NGOs. Now, NGOs will always come to you with a problem and will tell you, hey, there are these so many people, they don't have books to study, they don't have shoes to wear, they don't have uniforms. If you teach one, then good things will happen to that person, and that person would do well. So this is not direct reciprocation, but in a way, some of them will offer you some. I've seen some of them will offer you some prasad, or will send you some handmade, gifts made by the children, and say thank you for your support, and this is something, or they'll invite you to and honor you in their facility for as being one of the sponsors. This is a great example of how reciprocation is used, and it's mostly used by NGOs in India. As compared to that, the contrast principle heavily used by health insurance. So of late, one health insurance has been advertising heavily on radio, and they always, talk about how life would be better had this person had a health insurance versus if the person does not, right? So the key is to keep harping on the contrast. If you had this, it was better, and if just by spending 5 rupees a day for 365 days, you are covered for like 10 lakhs. So 5 rupees a day is a good example of using contrast principle. It just break it down relative to what you spend daily or monthly or even weekly. 5 rupees feels nothing, right? But you never consider, okay, I'm going to spend 5 rupees a day, or let's, for the simplicity, keep it 10 rupees a day, and it's 365 days. That means I'm spending 3,650 rupees a year. For what? You don't know. You're not calculating that far, right? Because health insurance, unlike life insurance, you get nothing in return, right? It's, if you fall sick, they pay for your hospitalization. That's it. But the contrast principle at play here is, I say 5 rupees a day or 10 rupees a day, and you say, okay, 10 rupees a day mein kya aata hai? Kuch nahi aata. Even platform ticket on the railway station is 10 rupees a day. Is that expensive? That low? So let me just do it. It doesn't matter. My health will remain fine, right? It's a good organization. Good. They use the contrast principles, and some of them build their influence according to that. See, you don't need to really pay that much. Just give me 10 rupees a day. I'll take care of your health. Good way to influence our customers. So one more exercise for you before we get into the exercise. Any more questions on these concepts? Okay, I can see some questions. So Divya, is it okay to take questions from here?
Sure, I can.
Okay. So, wow, I read a book by Robert Cialdini. So Robert Cialdini has done great amount of work in the influence space. One of the things that I learned from him is it takes about 38 touch points to make a sale. Back to the earlier question on consumer buying process, it takes 38 touch points, it seems. Some are subconscious, some are conscious, some digital, some social media, some physical. But Robert Cialdini actually breaks it down. I think I would really recommend the book. The book is, I think, called Influence by Robert Cialdini. And I would recommend all of that. While we're talking about books, note this two couple of books down. I really found them very useful. One is called Peak by Eric Anders. It's an excellent book. The book is called Peak, P-E-A-K. Eric Anders is the author. He gives amazing insights on how the consumer behavior, buying behavior works, but he also talks about how to improve your own performance. And he also talks about snippets on social media, etc. Um, can you give a practical example using contrast pencil selling digital services like high-end website or social media management? So Rahul, great question. Now, the thing is, the entire concept of uh, as a service, pay as a service, right? For example, cloud as a service or software as a service or as service economy is a highlighted experience of a contrast principle. So if you look at say HostGator, or if you look at some of these web hosting sites, they will talk about, they won't talk about, hey, you need to pay me $200 in a year. They'll not talk about it. They'll say as low as $5 a month you can go online, right? And they'll tell this to a small shopkeeper, and he's just thinking $5, even if in rupees, if I say it's like 350 rupees or 400 rupees a month, it's not much. So that is a great example of how you can sell high-end website or social media management service. So you say, I'm not you say I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to charge you a bulk, I'm going to charge you per month. That's one example. The other example, the other way you can do it is split it. So users just say, website maintenance services, whatever, X amount of rupees an annum, and say, okay, optimization of your website, loading speed, stuff like that. Now that's a small component, not very expensive, but it is Z amount of rupees. While you are selling X, you also package Z with it, and the Z should be smaller. And that way, though you split it into two, in the client's mind, relative to X, Z is smaller, so he will end up buying both from you, right? But it's a question of clearly how strong is your relationship, how influential are you to do this, and then which of those levers are you going to play. Contrast principle is a good lever to play, but you have to be very careful. It should not come across as you're cheating somebody, right? Because if you cheat them and they feel they're cheated, or then they will never say yes. As a matter of fact, one of the interesting things that I see is most survey reports in hospitals, for example, are always filled before they pay the bill, not after. Because after they pay the bill, there's cognitive dissonance. They took too much money for nothing. So that's another aspect to it. So while you're using contrast principle, be very careful, because it's a double-edged sword. It works very well, but sometimes it backfires. How can we leverage this from digital marketing perspective? Anuradha, can you be slightly more specific on what do you mean by this? Because Rahul gave a good example. That's one example, but I don't understand how can you leverage what influence from a digital marketing perspective. If you can elaborate, I'll answer that question. Can you explain the example of the toy sales during Christmas in US? Okay. Now, it's it's a very interesting example of how you can keep the growth, the volume of sale going despite season ending, right? And it works like this. What happens is every year, up in the US, especially after Black Friday, which is the day on which Thanksgiving holiday sales happen, to Christmas and New Year, most toy companies in the US start announcing this some super toy, right? Some big game or some very exciting robot or some car that everybody has to have, and they advertise on it crazily. While they do that, and there is this toy sale, though it is, we call it consistency, it is also combined with another principle called scarcity. I will not produce as much as there is demand, right? You understand that? So if demand is 100, I will say that, hey, I'm just going to produce 70. So in the end, there'll be at least 30 people who wouldn't find the toy, that specific toy, right? That is very popular. But as you have to give something for Christmas and your children are waiting for gifts, you buy something, right? But what the good, helpful salesman will do is also take your name and address and say, I will inform you the minute it's available, right? And then it is available in January. So you get a call about 15th or 16th of January saying, hey, the toy you ordered, it's available. You can come and pick it up, or I can have it shipped to you. And that way, the remaining 30 who could not get the toy continue to buy in January, February. That's why traditionally, if you look at the data for US sales, especially for toys, there is no dip in January and February. Actually, it continues to be high even in Jan and Feb, despite Christmas and New Year being over in December. It's a very interesting concept, and I put it on a consistency because year on year they do the same thing. They're consistent with it. So while that toy that they advertise is not available, they end up selling something else, and later they come back and call you for the toy as well. So it's like, in a way, I've made double sales to you. I don't know whether you share an example. How will you make relationship with the thought leaders of digital marketing industry when nobody knows you? Oh, hmm. How will you make a relationship when nobody knows you? See, relationships are built over time. First of all, I think somewhere we get confused that relationship is built in like 2 minutes. I think even Maggie noodles is not made in 2 minutes. The water has to be boiling hot, and then you put the noodles, and then it gets ready. But I get a lot of these questions on LinkedIn. I get a lot of requests on LinkedIn, and I'll tell you what not to do. I don't know what to do, but I'll tell you what not to do, Varun. The minute you send somebody a connection request on LinkedIn, and the minute he accepts, don't immediately try to sell him something, or ask him for a job, or ask him for an introduction, right? It does not work. That's not the way to build relationship. And I've heard too many stories in sales, that this sales guy, he went to this client, and the client said, I don't have time. He waited in the waiting room for 3 months. Every day he used to go and sit there. And one day the client says, I see you every day. What do you want? I have 5 minutes. You make a pitch. And he makes a pitch, and he wins this multi-crore deal. So I have never met that sales guy either. What it requires is for you to genuinely be interested in what that person is doing, and to genuinely connect with that person as an individual rather than making it transactional, right? So if I want to know you, and if I want to build a relationship with you, then I should be in a position to take interest in you. In today's world, we hardly get time to take interest in ourselves, forget about interest in others. So what I will do is choose a few. This is what I would do. Choose a few. There was a time when I was doing research on healthcare and who are the top influencers in healthcare. And the number one influencer was Barack Obama those days in healthcare. because he was doing the Affordable Care Act and stuff like that. There was no way I was going to get to know Barack Obama very well, right? So that was pointless. But I went through the list. I picked out the CIOs and the healthcare leaders in India who I was interested in connecting. I attended most conferences. I managed to meet a few. I genuinely took interest in what they were doing. I used to write a lot those days, and I will request them for interviews. I'll publish their interviews, and today they're my friends. But I've never tried to sell them anything till date. And if a sale happens, it's just incidental, right? So what I'll do is, if who are these thought leaders in digital marketing industry, make a list of them, try to know them better, try to be at events that they are, try to connect with them, take genuine interest in what they're doing, appeal to them. See, at the end of the day, as human beings, all of us like social connects. I hope that's helpful one. Uh, it's David Set Davidovitz, and the book is Everyone Lies. I think it's available on Amazon. Okay, so I'm just losing track of the question. So lots of questions. I mean, very good questions actually. Can you hint how B2B wholesale trading possible by digital marketing or can promote business? Okay, so B2B wholesale trading possible by digital marketing. I'm not an expert on wholesale trading, but can you elaborate? I mean, I'm not getting a sense of the question. And unfortunately, we are almost all out of time. So, Divya, should I just make a close and probably if there are more questions, you can send them to me later?
Sure, yes, we can do that. I think we have almost completed all the questions, by the way.
All right.
Yep.
Okay. So, in the end, I want to leave you with this exercise. Choose the style of influence that will help you the most. Keep relationship as a base. Put contrast principle, reciprocity, and consistency as the three drivers. Add as reason why you choose this style. If you say you choose contrast principle, add a reason why you want to choose that and how it helps you. And what is the one change that you would make to your strategy based on the webinar today? I think that will be very useful. Because if you continue to do what you do and expect different results, that's sign of insanity. That's what Einstein said. So the objective of this webinar and especially talking to you this afternoon was to give you a perspective of things I've seen, things I encounter daily, and how you can use some of these principles to help you. Right? With that, I want to thank you for your time. You've been a wonderful audience, and I hope you have a great Christmas and a very happy New Year. And hope
Thank
to
you
see
so
you
much.
soon on other web.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Divya.
Vikram. Just before everyone leaves out from the session, I would all request all of you to fill in the poll. It will just take a few seconds, and I have a small poll which is coming up next regarding your feedback for today's session. Um, Thank you so much, Vikram, for taking up the session. We loved having you here again, and we'll surely have you in the next year as well. It's great. It's always wonderful to hear you out.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. I've launched the last poll as well regarding the feedback. Just fill in it, guys, and we'll send out the recording to you by Tuesday. So if you have missed anything, we'll surely share out the recording to you. Thank you. Bye bye. Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.